In the quiet, God-fearing town of Dane, Wisconsin, where nothing more sinister than a missing pet had ever caused concern, one morning changed everything. Picture this: a Catholic priest, loved by his congregation and feared by his enemies, found with his throat brutally slit. The question isn't just who could do such a thing, but why. Nestled in the heart of the Midwest, Dane was the kind of small town where everyone knew each other, and St. Michael's Church stood as the spiritual pillar of the community. It was the morning of March 4th, 1998, when that peaceful facade was shattered. In the hallway of the parish school, Father Alfred Kunz, an outspoken, respected priest, was found in a pool of his own blood, his throat slashed with chilling precision. This was not the scene of a random act of violence. The sight that greeted law enforcement and the first responders who arrived at the scene was nothing short of horrifying. Blood stained the floors and walls of the sacred space that should have been a place of peace. Father Kuntz's body, positioned near the entrance of his office, was left in a manner that raised immediate questions. Who could commit such a brutal act? And what would drive someone to target a man of the cloth so viciously? The shock rippled through the community. Parishioners who had gathered at St. Michael's for daily routines were confronted with police barricades and whispers of murder. Speculation spread like wildfire. Was it a burglary gone wrong, or something far darker? For many, the idea that anyone would want to harm Father Kuntz seemed impossible. After all, he was more than a priest to them. He was a leader, a moral compass. But there was something about the way he was killed, the precision, the lack of evidence pointing to a struggle that suggested this was no ordinary crime. The brutality of the attack and the lack of immediate suspects left everyone grappling with the same terrifying question: who could have hated Father Kuntz enough to kill him? And perhaps even more disturbingly, was this just the beginning? From that moment on, the town of Dane was no longer the quiet, forgotten place it once was. The murder of Father Alfred Kunz had turned it into the center of one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in the country, where every whisper held the weight of suspicion and every glance felt like a potential clue to uncovering the dark secret that lay behind the priest's death. To understand why someone would kill Father Alfred Kunz, you first need to understand the man behind the collar, because while to some he was a guiding light, to others he was a threat. Father Alfred Kunz was not your average parish priest. Known for his unwavering commitment to the teachings of the Catholic Church, Kunz stood as a fortress of conservative values in a time when many sought to reshape and liberalize the faith. For over 30 years, he served St. Michael's Parish in Dane, Wisconsin, and during that time, he became a beloved figure for his congregation. But his loyalty to traditional Catholic doctrine also made him a controversial figure, especially among those pushing for modernization within the church. Kunz wasn't just a priest, he was a canon lawyer, someone deeply versed in church law. His legal expertise wasn't merely theoretical. Kunz had a reputation for digging into sensitive areas of church operations, often treading where others feared to go. Behind closed doors, he was known to be investigating cases of financial misconduct and sexual abuse within the church. These weren't small-scale parish squabbles. He was delving into issues that could shake the foundations of the diocese. But what made Father Kuntz even more polarizing was his public opposition to what he saw as the erosion of true Catholic values. As the world around him became more liberal, he remained steadfast. He preached traditional Catholicism unapologetically, resisting modern trends that sought to soften the Church's stance on issues like marriage, sexuality, and the role of women. His sermons were filled with the fire of conviction, and for many parishioners, his words provided the clarity they sought in an increasingly confusing world. Yet his iron grip on doctrine did not go unnoticed. His staunch position earned him both admiration and resentment in equal measure. To his congregation, he was a strict but caring leader, a man unafraid to speak the truth even when it was unpopular. To those within the church who wanted change, whether for reasons of reform or self interest, he was an obstacle, a barrier to progress. Father Kunz's refusal to bend to the pressures of modernity made him a target for criticism, not just from liberal factions within the church, but also from those whose secrets he may have been getting too close to uncovering. His investigation into misconduct within the diocese, particularly around issues of abuse and financial mismanagement, was no small affair. These were matters that could lead to careers being ruined, reputations destroyed, and livelihoods threatened. He was the kind of priest who made enemies not because of who he was, but because of what he represented, a man who saw the truth and wasn't afraid to expose it. Was it possible that someone within the church had decided Kant knew too much? Could his unwavering dedication to upholding the church's teachings have made him a liability, a man whose death would silence more than just his sermons? Father Alfred Kunz may have been a shepherd to his flock, but to others he was a dangerous man standing in the way of their ambitions, a man who could ruin lives with the truths he was poised to reveal. In life, Kant was a man of principle. But in death, he became something else entirely, an unsolved mystery, a warning, and perhaps the victim of a conspiracy far greater than anyone could have imagined. The scene that greeted investigators on the morning of March 4th, 1998, was not just a crime, it was a statement. The kind of statement that raises more questions than it answers. Father Alfred Kunz was found lying face down in the hallway of St. Michael's Parish School. His throat had been cut from ear to ear, a wound so deep it nearly decapitated him. The sheer brutality of the act was enough to send a shiver through even the most seasoned investigators. Yet there was something about the precision of the cut that immediately stood out. It wasn't sloppy or rushed. It was clinical, precise, almost as if the killer knew exactly what they were doing. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds on Father Kunz's hands. It was as if the killer had taken him by surprise, or perhaps even worse, that Father Kunz knew his killer and had let his guard down. The murder weapon was never found, and there were no immediate clues pointing to an obvious suspect. No footprints, no fingerprints, no clear motive left behind. It was a scene that raised more questions than it answered. The position of his body was another eerie detail. Father Kunz was found near the entrance of his office, as if he had been heading in or out when the attack happened. Some speculated that he had been ambushed, struck down before he even had a chance to react. The floor around him was slick with blood, but beyond the gruesome mess, there was a strange cleanliness to the crime. No evidence was left behind, no careless mistakes. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving only a trail of horror in their wake. As investigators combed through the scene, a chilling thought began to take root. This didn't look like a random attack. The precision of the wound, the lack of evidence, the near silence in which the crime had taken place, all of it pointed towards something much more sinister. Could this have been the work of a professional, someone hired to take out Father Kunz with surgical efficiency? It wasn't long before theories of a professional hit began to circulate. The idea that someone could have hired a killer to eliminate the priest wasn't out of the question, especially given Kunz's controversial work and the enemies he may have made along the way. The clean execution of the murder suggested that whoever did this knew what they were doing, perhaps even had experience in such matters. The deep, single cut to the throat wasn't the kind of injury someone could inflict easily, certainly not in a moment of passion or panic. It was deliberate, methodical. But there was another possibility, one that some investigators couldn't ignore. What if this wasn't the work of a hired killer? What if the person who killed Father Kunz did it out of pure, calculated hatred, the kind of hatred that doesn't leave room for mistakes? Perhaps this wasn't about money or power, but something far more personal. Father Kunz had made enemies, not just in the church, but beyond it. People who might have had their own reasons for wanting him silenced. Was this a crime of passion disguised as a professional hit, Or was it the work of someone who had killed before, leaving no trace behind because they had done this many times before? The community wanted answers, but the lack of clues left law enforcement chasing shadows. With every day that passed, the fear grew that Father Kunz's killer might never be caught. And yet, there was one thing everyone could agree on: this was not a random act of violence. Whoever killed Father Alfred Kunz had a purpose. They had a reason. And that reason would become the key to unlocking the mystery behind one of the most shocking murders the small town of Dane had ever seen. Behind the sacred walls of the church, where one would expect only reverence and faith, Father Alfred Kunz was uncovering something darker, something that may have cost him his life. Father Kunz was not just a spiritual leader, he was a man on a mission, and that mission extended far beyond his role as a parish priest. As a respected canon lawyer, he had access to the inner workings of the church, and what he found wasn't always holy. For years, Father Kunz had been quietly investigating cases of financial misconduct and sexual abuse within the church, determined to root out corruption wherever he found it. He was not afraid to go against the grain, even if it meant making powerful enemies within the diocese. Kunz was known for his staunch conservative views on Catholic doctrine, and he believed deeply in the Church's moral responsibility to its followers. But in the process of upholding those beliefs, he came across disturbing secrets. Rumors of priests involved in misconduct, allegations of cover ups, and financial irregularities that pointed to something much larger than just isolated incidents. These were not just small transgressions, these were potential scandals that could shake the very foundation of the diocese, if not the church at large. As he dug deeper into these matters, Father Kunz became a threat to those who had something to hide. His investigation wasn't just about exposing individuals, it was about exposing a culture of secrecy and corruption that ran deep within the institution he had dedicated his life to. He was getting closer to uncovering damaging secrets, secrets that certain people were willing to go to great lengths to protect. And as he pressed on, the risks to his own safety became ever more real. It wasn't just the financial misconduct that posed a threat. Father Kunz had reportedly been investigating allegations of sexual abuse involving priests, an issue that would later explode into the public consciousness in the early 2000s with widespread revelations of abuse within the Catholic Church. But back in 1998, these issues were still largely hidden, swept under the rug by a system more interested in protecting its image than seeking justice for victims. And Kant, with his relentless pursuit of the truth, was seen as a ticking time bomb by those who wanted to keep these crimes buried. The deeper he went, the more enemies he made. Some within the church saw him as a liability, a man who was willing to expose the institution to scandal and ruin if it meant holding wrongdoers accountable. Others, perhaps, saw him as a threat to their own personal power and influence. After all, in an institution as hierarchical as the Catholic Church, there were many who had much to lose if Kunz succeeded in bringing their actions to light. Whispers began to circulate that Father Kunz's investigations had put him in danger. Was it possible that someone within the church, someone with a vested interest in keeping these secrets hidden, had decided that Kunz had to be silenced? His murder came at a time when he was allegedly getting closer to uncovering serious wrongdoing. Could his death have been a preemptive strike by someone desperate to protect their position, their power, or even the church itself? The possibility that someone within the church hierarchy might have been involved in his murder added a new layer of darkness to the case. The very institution Father Kunz had dedicated his life to was now under suspicion. Was it a rogue individual acting out of self-interest, or was there a more organized effort to stop him from revealing what he knew? Father Kunz's murder left these questions hanging in the air. What had he found? Who had he angered? And most disturbingly, how far would someone within the church go to keep their secrets safe? The investigation into his death would need to uncover more than just the identity of the killer. It would need to peel back the layers of church politics and corruption that might have driven someone to commit such a heinous act in the first place. As if the brutal murder of a priest wasn't shocking enough, whispers of something far darker began to circulate in the wake of Father Alfred Kunz's death, whispers of rituals, of symbols, of things that don't belong in the realm of faith, but rather in the shadows. In the months leading up to Father Kunz's murder, rumors had begun to spread about occult activities in and around Dane, Wisconsin. These weren't just idle small town rumors. There were stories, some whispered in fear, others dismissed as local superstition, that suggested a growing interest in satanic rituals and occult practices in the area. Whether these claims held any truth or were simply the product of overactive imaginations didn't matter. What did matter was that they added another chilling layer to an already horrific crime. Father Kuntz, being the devout and conservative priest he was, would not have stood by if he believed satanic or occult practices were taking root in his community. According to some, he had been investigating these dark whispers, determined to root out any evil influence from the town and his parish. These weren't investigations carried out in the light of day, but rather quiet inquiries reaching out to people he trusted, gathering information, trying to understand if there was something sinister at play beneath the surface of the otherwise peaceful town. But the deeper you look into darkness, the more likely it is that something will look back at you. Whether Father Kuntz found any solid evidence of occult practices remains unclear, but one thing is certain: his death sparked a wave of speculation. Some locals claimed that his murder was connected to the very thing he was investigating, that he had come too close to uncovering a dark, hidden world of satanic rituals, and his death was a warning to others to stay away. Others believed that the precision and brutality of his murder had occult undertones, a symbolic act meant to send a message not just to the town, but to the church itself. Adding to the atmosphere of fear was the fact that Dane, like many small towns, had its fair share of superstition. People were already on edge after the murder, and these rumors only intensified the paranoia. It didn't help that during the 1980s and 90s, the United States experienced what came to be known as the Satanic Panic, a widespread fear of satanic ritual abuse, fueled by media reports and conspiracy theories. Even if there was no hard evidence to support these claims, the mere suggestion of occult involvement was enough to ignite the imaginations of a community already shaken to its core. The police, for their part, investigated these rumors but found no concrete proof that occult activity played a role in Father Kunz's death. And yet, the rumors persisted. Perhaps it was because his murder was so brutal, so precise, so devoid of any clear motive, that people began to look for explanations beyond the rational. When a good man is killed in such a horrific way, especially a man of faith, people search for reasons that go beyond the ordinary. For some, the idea that a priest like Kuntz could be targeted by forces darker than mere human greed or hatred felt all too real. These whispers of the occult, whether founded or not, fed into the growing mystery surrounding Father Kuntz's murder. Was his death simply the result of a personal vendetta, or was there something more at play? Something deeper, more sinister, something rooted in the very evil he had fought so hard against? The truth about these rumors may never be known, but for the people of Dane, Wisconsin, the suggestion that their beloved priest could have been drawn into a battle against forces beyond the material world only added to the eerie atmosphere that settled over the town in the wake of his death. As time passed, the lines between reality and speculation blurred, and the truth became harder to distinguish from the fear that had taken hold of the community. Was Father Kunz's murder tied to dark forces lurking beneath the surface, or was it simply a case of small town superstition running wild in the face of an unspeakable crime? To this day, those questions linger, casting a shadow over the unsolved case. When a priest is murdered in a quiet town, the assumption is that justice will be swift, that the truth will emerge quickly. But in the case of Father Alfred Kunz, the investigation only deepened the mystery, revealing far more questions than answers. The murder of Father Alfred Kunz was not treated as a typical crime. From the moment his body was discovered in the hallway of St. Michael's Parish School, law enforcement knew this was no ordinary case. The brutality of the attack, combined with the high profile of the victim, made it clear that they were dealing with something far more complicated. Investigators from Dane County Sheriff's Office quickly arrived at the scene and began their painstaking work. Yet, despite their efforts, the early days of the investigation yielded little in the way of concrete leads. Initially, detectives scoured the crime scene for any evidence that could point them toward a suspect. They examined the precise, deep cut to Father Kunz's throat, trying to determine whether the attack had been the work of a professional or someone who simply had a cold, calculating mindset. They searched the parish school, the surrounding church grounds, and Father Kunz's office for clues, but what they found, or rather, what they didn't find, became a source of frustration. There were no fingerprints, no blood trails, no obvious signs of a struggle. It was as if the killer had moved in and out of the church without leaving a trace, something that pointed to a well-planned execution rather than a crime of passion. One of the first questions investigators asked themselves was whether Father Kunz had known his killer. Given the lack of defensive wounds and the positioning of his body, some believed that he might have been taken by surprise or that he had trusted the person who attacked him. If that were the case, the killer could have been someone close to him, someone who had access to the church and who Father Kunz would not have suspected. Yet, despite interviewing parishioners, friends, and colleagues, no immediate suspect emerged from within his circle. The investigation expanded, but every lead seemed to fizzle out before it could turn into anything concrete. There were initial whispers of parishioners who might have had personal grievances with Father Kunz, possibly over his strict, traditional views on Catholic doctrine. But those leads quickly went cold as investigators found no evidence tying any of them to the crime. Even the rumors of his involvement in exposing misconduct within the church, while plausible motives, didn't point to any specific individual who might have carried out such a brutal attack. Detectives also considered the possibility of a random act of violence, but this theory felt increasingly unlikely. The precision of the murder, the lack of evidence, and the absence of any clear motive for a random attack left investigators doubtful that this was a crime committed on impulse. And with no murder weapon recovered, no DNA, and no physical evidence to tie anyone to the scene, the investigation began to stall. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the frustration within the investigation grew. Leads that had once seemed promising evaporated into dead ends. Investigators interviewed over 200 people, followed countless tips, and even explored the bizarre occult rumors that were circulating in the town, but none of it brought them closer to identifying a suspect. The case seemed to be slipping further and further away, with no arrests, no major breakthroughs, and no answers. For law enforcement, it was a nightmare scenario. How does a respected priest, beloved by his community, end up murdered in his own parish without leaving a single clue behind? And more disturbingly, how could the investigation yield so little despite the enormity of the crime? With each passing day, the fear that Father Kunz's killer might never be caught grew. The public, too, grew restless. The small town of Dane, once a place of peace and community, now lived under a cloud of fear and suspicion. Every whispered rumor, every new theory added to the collective anxiety. People began to lose faith, not just in the investigation, but in the possibility of justice ever being served. The murder of Father Kunz was a wound that refused to heal, and as law enforcement hit wall after wall, it became clear that solving this case was not going to be as straightforward as anyone had hoped. The early stages of the investigation had been thorough but ultimately fruitless. The detectives had their theories, but no suspect. The community had their suspicions, but no proof. And with no hard evidence to guide them, the case began to fade from the headlines, lingering as an unsolved tragedy, with no one closer to finding the truth about who killed Father Alfred Kunz and why. In the absence of hard evidence, one thing filled the void: speculation. And in the case of Father Alfred Kunz, there was no shortage of theories about who could have wanted him dead and why. As the investigation into Father Kunz's murder stalled, attention turned to the possible suspects who might have had a reason to want him silenced. Without a clear motive, investigators and the public alike began to explore every possible angle, from the obvious to the far-fetched. Kunz's position as a staunch conservative in the Catholic Church, his involvement in exposing corruption, and the mysterious circumstances of his death opened up a wide range of possibilities. Some believed that the answer could lie close to home, while others speculated about a more sinister, distant hand in his demise. One of the first groups of suspects that investigators considered were the parishioners themselves. Father Kunz had a strong personality, and his strict adherence to traditional Catholic doctrine didn't sit well with everyone. Some within his own parish had reportedly clashed with him over his conservative views, especially on sensitive issues like marriage, sexuality, and the role of women in the church. To those who found his positions too rigid or outdated, Kunz was not just a priest, but an obstacle to progress. Could one of these disagreements have boiled over into something more violent? It seemed possible. After all, small town conflicts can fester and escalate in unpredictable ways. But despite interviewing dozens of his parishioners, investigators found no one with both the means and motive to carry out such a calculated and brutal murder. Next came the question of whether someone within the church hierarchy might have wanted Kunz dead. As a canon lawyer, Kunz had been investigating serious issues within the diocese, including allegations of sexual abuse and financial misconduct. These investigations weren't just minor inquiries, they had the potential to expose significant wrongdoing, and some suspected that his murder might have been an attempt to silence him before he revealed too much. In the tight-knit, highly political world of church leadership, Kunz's investigations could have made him enemies in high places. But again, investigators hit a wall. While it was plausible that someone within the church had a motive to silence Kunz, there was no hard evidence to support the theory. One theory that gained traction was the possibility that Father Kunz had been the victim of a professional hit. The precision of the attack, the deep, singular cut to the throat, and the lack of any physical evidence suggested a level of expertise that pointed to a calculated, deliberate killing. Some believed that Kunz had made enemies not just within the church, but perhaps with individuals or organizations outside of it. Could someone have hired a professional to carry out the hit, ensuring that no trace was left behind? The idea seemed plausible, especially given the precision of the murder. But who would have ordered such an execution? Was it someone trying to protect the church from scandal? Or was it an enemy Kunz had made through his investigations into misconduct? Then there was the theory of revenge. Kunz was known for being uncompromising, particularly when it came to his beliefs and his pursuit of justice. He had made a career of exposing wrongdoing, and in doing so, he had undoubtedly made enemies. Perhaps someone who had been affected by his investigations, someone whose career or reputation had been damaged by the truths he had uncovered, had decided to take matters into their own hands. This wasn't an impulsive act of rage, it was cold, calculated revenge. If that was the case, it would explain the meticulous nature of the murder and the absence of evidence, suggesting that the killer had taken great care to ensure they were never caught. Yet there was no clear suspect who fit this theory either. Despite Father Kunz's many enemies both within and outside of the church, no one emerged as an obvious perpetrator. The case was complicated by the fact that Kunz's murder seemed to transcend a single clear motive. Was this about silencing a man who was getting too close to uncovering something dangerous? Was it an act of vengeance by someone whose life had been upended by Kunz's investigations? Or was it something far darker, possibly even linked to the rumors of occult activity that had surfaced in the aftermath of his death? Each theory had its strengths and weaknesses, but none provided the definitive answers the investigators were searching for. As the months went by, the list of suspects grew longer, but the evidence to support any particular theory remained elusive. The truth about who killed Father Kuntz and why seemed to slip further away with every passing day, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and growing frustration. Was the answer hiding in plain sight in the people closest to him, or was it buried deep within the shadows of the church, protected by those who had the most to lose if the truth ever came out? As the investigation dragged on, it became clear that this was not a case with simple answers. Father Kunz's death, much like his life, was shrouded in complexity, and the key to solving the mystery might lie in motives that no one had yet considered. When a man of the cloth is murdered, the church is expected to rally for truth and justice. But in the case of Father Alfred Kunz, the silence that followed his death was as deafening as the crime itself. The murder of Father Alfred Kunz sent shockwaves through the Catholic community, especially within the Diocese of Madison, Wisconsin. This was not just the death of a priest. It was a brutal, calculated killing that had occurred in a place of sanctity, leaving the entire religious community in a state of disbelief. The immediate response from the diocese was one of public grief and calls for prayers, as church leaders offered words of comfort to the shocked parishioners of St. Michael's. But beyond the public displays of sorrow, there was a growing undercurrent of unease about how the church was handling the aftermath of Father Kunz's death. From the very beginning, the Catholic Church was quick to downplay any rumors of internal corruption or scandal being linked to the murder. Official statements focused on Kunz's role as a beloved priest and canon lawyer, avoiding any mention of the darker investigations he had been pursuing in the years leading up to his death. While parishioners mourned, those close to the case couldn't help but notice a certain reluctance from church officials to engage with the more controversial aspects of Father Kunz's life. His work uncovering financial misconduct and investigating sexual abuse within the church was well known to those familiar with him, but it was almost entirely absent from the church's official narrative in the wake of his murder. Behind closed doors, there were whispers that the diocese might have had more than just grief on its mind. Some speculated that church leaders feared the implications of a full investigation into Kunz's work, especially if it exposed widespread corruption or abuse within the church. After all, the late 1990s were a turbulent time for the Catholic Church. In the years following Kunz's death, the floodgates would open on the sexual abuse scandals that had been festering for decades, revealing systemic cover-ups and abuses that shocked the world. But in 1998, the church was still desperately trying to keep its reputation intact. There was a growing sense among some investigators and those close to Kuntz that the church's reluctance to fully cooperate may have inadvertently or perhaps intentionally hindered the investigation. It wasn't that the diocese refused to help outright, but their involvement was measured, cautious. Officials were careful in their statements, and there was little enthusiasm for probing too deeply into Father Kuntz's personal inquiries, especially those involving misconduct within the church. For many, this raised an uncomfortable question. Was the Catholic Church more interested in protecting its reputation than in finding out who killed one of its own? There were also whispers that certain members of the church hierarchy might have had more direct reasons to avoid scrutiny. Kuntz had been a thorn in the side of those he investigated, and his willingness to expose corruption put him at odds with powerful figures within the diocese. Could it be that someone within the church had a vested interest in ensuring that the investigation into his death didn't dig too deep? If Kunz had uncovered something truly damning, something that could damage not just individuals but the institution itself, would the church have acted to protect itself rather than pursue justice for one of its priests? The question of whether the church actively suppressed parts of the investigation remains one of the most controversial aspects of Father Kunz's murder. Some argue that the diocese, while publicly supportive, was privately cautious about encouraging too much scrutiny, fearing that the investigation might uncover more than they could control. Others believe that church officials may have unintentionally stifled the investigation by refusing to acknowledge the extent of Kunz's involvement in sensitive matters. Either way, the result was the same: a murder investigation that seemed to stall before it even had a chance to fully explore the darker corners of the case. For those seeking justice, the church's guarded response was deeply troubling. While law enforcement pursued leads and interviewed hundreds of people, they couldn't shake the feeling that some crucial pieces of the puzzle were being kept out of reach. It wasn't just about finding Father Kunz's killer, it was about understanding the broader context of his death. If the church was unwilling to face that reality, it meant that the investigation would never truly get to the heart of the matter. Even now, over 2 decades later, the role of the Catholic Church in the investigation into Father Kunz's murder remains a point of speculation. Was the investigation hindered by the institution he had served so faithfully? Did the Church, in its efforts to protect itself, fail to protect one of its own? The answers to these questions are as elusive as the identity of Kunz's killer, leaving the case steeped in uncertainty and unresolved tension. What remains clear is that the Catholic Church's response to Father Kunz's murder was not just about mourning a fallen priest, it was about managing a crisis, and in that management, some believe, lies the reason why his killer was never brought to justice. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the most brutal events, but in the case of Father Alfred Kunz, the passage of 25 years has done nothing to bring peace, only more questions. More than 2 decades have passed since the murder of Father Kunz, yet the case remains as cold as the day it went unsolved. Despite numerous leads, intense investigations, and countless theories, no arrests have ever been made, no one has been charged, and the murder of the beloved priest remains an open wound for his community. The longer it remains unsolved, the deeper the sense of frustration and grief for those who knew him and those who remain haunted by the mystery of his death. In Dane, Wisconsin, St. Michael's Parish has never quite recovered from the shock of that fateful day in March 1998. For a long time, the church itself seemed to stand as a somber reminder of the tragedy, a place of worship now shadowed by one of the most horrific unsolved murders in the region's history. Parishioners who had once found solace in the pews now gathered with an unease that had never existed before. The hallways of the parish school where Father Kunz's body was discovered still carry the weight of his last moments, and the echoes of that day have never fully faded. For Father Kunz's closest friends and fellow priests, the lack of resolution has been a heavy burden. Many who knew him continue to wonder why justice has never been served. His legacy as a devout, unflinchingly conservative priest is forever intertwined with the mystery of his violent death. Those who were closest to him continue to ask themselves the same questions: who could have hated him enough to carry out such a brutal act? Was it someone from within the church, someone he trusted? Or was it a person he had never met, acting on orders from a far more powerful entity? These lingering questions have kept the case alive even as it grows colder with each passing year. How could a high-profile murder, one that involved a respected and controversial figure like Father Kunz, go unsolved for so long? Theories abound, but none have provided definitive answers. Investigators once hoped that advances in forensic technology, particularly DNA analysis, might breathe new life into the case. But despite these hopes, no significant breakthroughs have materialized. The case file, once thick with interviews and evidence, has grown dusty, untouched by new developments. For the community, it's not just the lack of justice that haunts them, it's the silence. Over the years, many have speculated that those responsible for Father Kunz's death are still out there, living their lives without consequence. There's an unsettling feeling that the truth might be known to some, hidden behind layers of fear, corruption, or self preservation. The idea that someone could have gotten away with murder, especially one so heinous and high profile, has only deepened the town's unease. And yet, the most haunting question of all remains: why has this case remained unsolved for so long? For a murder that shook not just the town, but the entire diocese and beyond, how could it simply fade from the spotlight? Was it because of who Father Kuntz was, a priest who had angered powerful people within the church and perhaps beyond? Or was it because the nature of his death was so mysterious, so meticulously executed, that the killer or killers left no trace behind? There are those who believe that the very institution Father Kuntz served may have inadvertently or intentionally obstructed the investigation, whether to protect the church's image or to keep hidden the truths Kuntz was close to exposing. Others suggest that law enforcement simply ran out of leads, overwhelmed by the complexities of the case and the web of potential motives surrounding Father Kunz's life and work. As the years have passed, the story of Father Kunz's murder has slipped out of the headlines, remembered only by those who were closest to him, or those who are particularly drawn to the mystery of unsolved crimes. But for the people of Dane, Wisconsin, the shadow of his death has never truly lifted. It's not just the murder of a man that weighs on them, it's the unanswered questions that have lingered for a quarter of a century. Could the killer still be walking free? Will justice ever be served for Father Kuntz, or will his murder remain one of those unsolved tragedies forever shrouded in silence, with the truth locked away in the memories of those who took it to their graves? As it stands today, the case of Father Alfred Kunz is not just an unsolved murder, it's a symbol of all the questions that remain unanswered, and for a community once bound by faith, it's a lingering reminder that justice, like faith, sometimes feels just out of reach. A crime like the murder of Father Alfred Kunz doesn't just fade into history. It lingers not just in the minds of those who knew him, but in the hearts of all who seek justice for the unspeakable. The murder of Father Alfred Kunz remains one of the most chilling unsolved cases in modern times. More than 2 decades have passed, and yet the questions surrounding his death remain as pressing and painful as ever. How could a man so deeply rooted in his faith, a man dedicated to exposing the truth, meet such a violent end without anyone being held accountable? The absence of justice is not just a wound for his community, it is a wound for anyone who believes that truth and justice should prevail in the end. Speculation has run wild for years. Could new evidence one day emerge to shed light on who killed Father Kuntz? Advances in forensic technology have solved cold cases before, sometimes decades after the fact. There is hope that perhaps someday a breakthrough might bring closure to this mystery. Perhaps someone, somewhere, holds a piece of information that could finally point law enforcement in the right direction. Or maybe it will be science itself, DNA analysis, or other advancements that uncovers the truth long buried beneath layers of silence and fear. There are those who hold out hope that new witnesses will come forward, that someone who has kept quiet all these years might finally break their silence. Or perhaps someone within the church with knowledge of what really happened might decide to clear their conscience. But for now, we are left with only theories, suspicions, and the haunting fact that whoever killed Father Kuntz has never been brought to justice. The mystery of his death endures, and while the case remains cold, it is far from forgotten. Father Kunz's legacy is not just in the sermons he gave, the truths he sought to uncover, or the parishioners he guided. It is in the unanswered questions that still echo in the halls of St. Michael's Church and in the hearts of those who refuse to let his memory fade into obscurity. To you, the listener, this story might raise more questions than it answers, but that is the nature of an unsolved crime, one that invites endless speculation, analysis, and discussion. What do you think happened to Father Kunz? Was he the victim of a professional hit? Was his death tied to the very church he had served for so long? Or was there something more personal, something hidden in the shadows of his life's work that led to his murder? As we conclude this journey through one of the most unsettling unsolved cases, I encourage you to keep the memory of Father Alfred Kunz alive. His life was one of dedication to truth and justice, and his death, though unsolved, is not something we should allow to fade into silence. Perhaps, with enough attention, with enough people asking the right questions, someone will finally come forward with the answers we need. So, as we close this chapter, remember that the case of Father Kunz is not just a mystery. It is a reminder that justice sometimes takes years, even decades, to find its way. And while the answers may not come today or tomorrow, we must continue to seek them. Because as long as we remember him, and as long as we keep asking the hard questions, the story of Father Alfred Kunz remains very much alive.